Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about common knowledge and how do we determine whether information we're using in an essay is common knowledge, which means it does not have to be cited, or information that I need to put a in-text citation afterwards. So this is a subject that is confusing to many students, and it can be a little tricky and difficult to start to figure out what is common knowledge and what is not. So I have recruited the following site from the Academic Integrity at MIT Handbook for Students to help us figure this out. So they have a very nice description here of what is common knowledge. So common knowledge is information that is so well known that people don't need to cite the information. It is considered well known enough that the average educated reader would accept it as reliable without having to look it up. So this is kind of the guideline. However, this is a pretty vague notion. What constitutes the average educated reader? So, many of the things that we would consider common knowledge would be information that we would consider that most people would know. So, for instance, most people would know that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit if you're in the States, or 0 degrees Celsius in Canada, or that Barack Obama was the first American of mixed race to be elected president. So, I'm going to pop over here and take a look at this essay I've been writing on Leonardo da Vinci. And I've got some information here at the beginning. Leonardo da Vinci is best known as a Renaissance painter. It is true that he was a master in this regard, and his paintings such as the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper remain some of the most recognizable paintings anywhere in the world. I don't need to cite this information. The average educated reader would understand that Leonardo da Vinci was a Renaissance painter because of his fame. He's a quite well-known painter. And most people would know that the Mona Lisa was painted by him, the Mona Lisa being one of the most famous paintings in the world. This would be considered common knowledge. Other information that is shared by a culture or national group, such as the names of famous heroes or events, that won't need to be cited. So, for instance, in Canada, we know that Thanksgiving is occurring in October. If you are writing a paper for a Canadian audience, you would not need to tell them that Thanksgiving was in October. However, Americans celebrate Thanksgiving in November. If you were writing to an American audience, you would want to mention in an in-text citation that Canadian Thanksgiving was in October, if you were mentioning it to them, because that is not an audience for whom that would be common knowledge. Here's an interesting one, knowledge shared by members of a certain field of study. So the example that they give here, which is about Bragg's law and the necessary conditions for diffraction of radiation of wavelength, this would be something that, for me, would certainly not be common knowledge. I don't work in this field. I work in the field of library studies. Bragg's law is not known to me. I don't know what that is. So if I was using Bragg's law in an essay that I was writing, it would make sense for me to cite that information because I am not an authority in that field, nor would I be writing to people who would be authorities in that field. So I'm not writing to an audience that is familiar with Bragg's law, most likely. However, if you were somebody working in the field of possibly physics in this case, Bragg's law might be familiar to you. That would be maybe considered common knowledge in that field. So if you were writing a paper that was for physics teachers or physics instructors or physicists, you would not need to necessarily tell them what Bragg's law is through an in-text citation. They would assume that they would know that knowledge, being professional physicists. You have to remember that what is common knowledge in one culture or one academic group may not be common knowledge in another. So when you're trying to determine should I use that information as common knowledge or not, you have to ask yourself a few questions. Okay, first of all, who's the audience that you're talking to? In high school, your audience is most likely your teacher and your classmates. How much would they really realistically know about this topic? If the answer is not very much, then you want to err on the side of citing a lot of information. What can you assume that they already know? Well, it's a pretty safe assumption, for instance, to assume that people know that the Mona Lisa was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. That would be a pretty reasonable assumption. Will I be asked where I obtained my information? So, if you're going to be questioned about the information, you should be prepared to answer where you got it. The easiest way to do that is through in-text citing. You should always be prepared to tell anybody who asks about your information where you got the information from, where was it obtained. And they give some examples there that you could look at. Okay? But the best advice here is when you don't know if it's common knowledge or not, put an in-text citation in. It's always better to err on the side of in-text citing than it is to miss something and inadvertently plagiarize. So I hope that helps understand a little bit about what common knowledge is. There's a whole section here on what common knowledge is not, but you'll find this section a little bit perhaps advanced for high school. It starts to talk about very specific things. I would say stick to this advice. When in doubt, cite your source. Can't go wrong with an in-text citation. I hope that helps everybody understand what common knowledge is.